It was Christmas Eve, and I had just finished my shift at the office. I had the next few days off, and I was eager to head home and celebrate with my kids. Being a single mother of two, I regretfully didn't have much time to spend with them, recently being so slammed with work. So the next few days were going to be just hot cocoa, gingerbread houses, Santa, and presents. However, fate had other plans for me. After driving for about 15 minutes, my car mysteriously began to shudder and then quickly shut off as I pulled to the side of the road. I turned the ignition over and over again but had no luck. It was just killing the battery. I looked at the gauge and realized my gas tank was almost empty. I couldn't believe it. I swear I had at least a half tank this morning when I got to the office. I started to panic, thinking about my children and how I would get home now. I was on a back road in the middle of the woods by myself, not fully realizing the severity of my situation, but at least I had a phone. I pulled my phone out of my purse. Luckily, I still had service. I searched the nearest towing company, called them, and the dispatcher said it would take at least 45 minutes for the driver to reach me. I sighed in frustration, but there was nothing I could do about it. So I called my son and told him regrettably I was going to be an hour or so late. My oldest son was 13 and my daughter was 9. They already sounded preoccupied with video games anyways. I told them not to worry, I will see you soon and I love you, and we hung up. I took a deep breath and tried to relax while I began to wait for the tow truck to show up. As I sat there, the sun began to set. I couldn't help but feel frustrated. This was not how I wanted to start my next few days off with my children. I had just leaned back in my seat when I noticed in my left side mirror I could make out a man in the distance rapidly approaching on a bicycle. He was coming up from the road behind me and was on the other side of the street. As he passed, he gave me an unsettling stare, but he didn't strike me as aggressive, probably because of the Santa hat he was wearing. It was just something about the way he stared at me, just the smirk he had on his face. I quickly brushed it off and turned my attention to the beautiful sunset in front of me, the pink and orange hues cascading across the sky, painting a peaceful picture. It was sadly not going to be a white Christmas this year, though. I closed my eyes and took in the fresh air, feeling grateful for this small moment of peace amidst the chaos. As I was looking down the road towards the sunset, I noticed the same man on the bike again. He was only about 100 feet or so away and was now riding slowly around in circles in the middle of the road, where it disappeared off to the right. I couldn't help but feel a little scared now, but I reminded myself to stay calm. But then, as I watched him, he suddenly turned his bike straight towards me and started pedaling faster and faster. My heart began to race as he got closer, and my hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel. All of a sudden, he stopped in the middle of the road and just looked in my direction. I could see that smirk on his face even from this distance. I quickly reached for my purse, pulled out my pepper spray, and sat there clutching it, my heart pumping wildly. We now began to stare at each other for what seemed like forever. I couldn't understand what was going on, but I knew I needed to get out of there. My heart continued to race as the man slowly started pedaling towards my car again, still with that unsettling smirk on his face. Then suddenly, he stopped again, no further than 30 feet or so, pulled off his backpack and started fumbling with the zipper. I was on the verge of tears and was already contemplating my escape out the passenger door and off into the woods. I was about to dial 911 and make a run for it, but then like a miracle, a pair of headlights rounded the corner and were approaching quickly from behind. The man then looked towards the headlights, then locked eyes with me. He grinned widely and turned his bike to ride off in the opposite direction. As the headlights pulled up behind me, I quickly got out of my car and frantically waved for help. Thankfully, it was the tow truck, and he happened to be closer than expected. The driver looked at me with concern as I frantically explained what just happened. He helped me calm down and assured me he would help if the man came back, saying he deals with these kinds of people all the time. He offered to let me sit in the cab while I waited, and I agreed. As the tow truck driver was loading my car, he walks up to the window and says, "Well, I think I found your problem." I was shining a flashlight and noticed there were small pools and drops of gasoline on the flatbed coming from near the gas tank. He then tells me, "It looks like someone drilled a hole in your gas tank." My heart sank in utter horror. The man on the bike must have sabotaged my car while I was at work and was waiting for me to break down. But how would he have found me with only a bike? I thought, and why? It still didn't make any sense. The tow truck driver then called the police and we waited together until they arrived. After the police arrived and took my statement, they searched the area for the man on the bike, but he was nowhere to be found. They told me they would do their best to track him down and bring him to justice. I couldn't believe that someone would go to such lengths just to harm a complete stranger. They had my car towed to a shop, and the police gave me a ride home. I was just so thankful to be with my kids and in the safety of my own home. I couldn't sleep that night, thinking about what could have happened if the tow truck driver hadn't shown up when he did. I couldn't have gotten a better gift. I also couldn't shake off the feeling of violation and fear that lingered after this incident. It made me realize how vulnerable we can be in certain situations and how important it is to be prepared for anything. My parents had decided to take me to a Christmas tree farm to pick out our very own tree this year. I was so excited, as this was the first time we ever had a real tree in our home. We arrived at the farm just before sunset, and I remember feeling giddy with anticipation. The cold air nipped at my cheeks as we made our way through the rows of trees, searching for the perfect one. The farm was offering free hot apple cider to anyone who wanted it, and the smell of cinnamon and spices filled the air. As we walked, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet it was. There were not that many other families out picking their trees, and even the birds seemed to have been silent. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was too caught up in the excitement of my cider and picking out a tree. We finally found a tall, full tree that my dad deemed perfect, so he pulled out his saw, crouched down on one knee and started sawing. He got about halfway through the base of it when he stopped and asked if I wanted to help. Of course I did, so I eagerly took the saw and started to help him. We worked together, my small hands gripping the saw tightly as we made our way through the trunk. I was so proud of myself, feeling like a real man and helping my dad. Once we were finished, we carried the tree to the front where they put it in a machine that shakes out anything living in it. While we were standing there, I realized just how bad I had to use the bathroom, so I asked my mom if they had a restroom I could use. She told me to go ask one of the workers we passed earlier and then said to meet them back at the car when I was done. As I made my way to the worker towards the back of the farm, something caught my eye in the distance to my right. It looked like a figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching us. I couldn't make out any distinct features, but it gave me an uneasy feeling. I quickly forgot about it and continued towards the worker who pointed me in the direction of a small porta potty, which I was not thrilled about using. But nature called, and I had no choice but to answer. As I approached the porta potty, it occurred to me that the figure at the edge of the forest was no longer there. I brushed it off and went about my business, but as I was finishing up, I heard a rustling noise coming from the trees behind the restroom. I froze, my heart racing as I tried to listen more closely. Then suddenly, it stopped. I quickly finished my business and exited as fast as I could while starting to get scared. Once I was out, I tried to hurry back to the car, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being followed. There were not many people around and it was getting dark quickly. As I left the porta potty, it occurred to me that the figure at the edge of the forest was no longer there. It was then that I smelled it, that familiar scent of smoke. I noticed shadows beginning to dance around me on the ground as if they were coming alive. I quickly glanced over my shoulder and to my horror, towards the back of the tree farm where I was just at. Huge flames were beginning to rise and spread rapidly. I turned and ran as fast as my legs could carry me back to the main area of the tree farm, yelling for help along the way. By this time, other visitors had also realized what was happening, and a few brave souls had already started trying to put out the fire with buckets of water. The flames spread so fast that by the time I realized what was happening, the farm was almost halfway engulfed. The smoke was now filling the air and making it hard to see and breathe. As I watched in horror, the panicked screams of people trying to save themselves and others filled the air. The once peaceful tree farm had turned into a chaotic scene, with flames leaping high into the sky and smoke billowing out in all directions. Then I saw him again. The figure was standing in the same spot that I had seen him earlier in, near the edge of the woods. But this time, I could see the twisted smile on his face as he watched the destruction unfold. It was then that I realized this wasn't just an accident. I couldn't stop staring at him. It was like I was in some sort of trance. Scared beyond belief, it was that moment that my father picked me up from behind and began to carry me out of the smoke and back to the car. I kept trying to point and tell him about the figure that I saw as he was carrying me, but he said we will worry about it later. We made it to the car and my father said to wait here with my mom, and then he headed back to see if anyone else needed help. All while my mother was yelling to please be careful. I couldn't shake off the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence. There was something sinister about that figure, and I had to tell someone about what I had just seen. A few minutes had gone by and my father returned, saying that he thinks everyone made it out safely. We all sat waiting for the fire department to arrive and watched as the flames destroyed everything. It was then that I finally told my parents about the figure I had seen, and they exchanged worried glances. They didn't believe me at first, but as we sat there waiting for the chaos to subside, they started to realize that something wasn't right. The fire department arrived and began to put out the fire, while my parents spoke with the authorities about what I had told them. I overheard them talking about how the fire had started in multiple places and that it was unlikely for it to have spread so quickly on its own. My parents grew more concerned and made sure to keep a close eye on me as we waited for everything to be sorted out. After that, the police asked me a series of questions and took a statement from me. As the night went on, I couldn't shake off the feeling of paranoia. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure and what role they played in this fire. I was convinced that they were to blame for everything and that they were still lurking somewhere, watching me. My parents tried to reassure me and told me that it was probably just my imagination, but I couldn't shake off the feeling. Finally, after hours of waiting, we were allowed to go back home. We later learned that the cause of the fire was indeed arson and that the culprit was still at large. My parents hugged me tightly, grateful that we had made it out safely, but I couldn't help but feel guilty for not speaking up sooner about what I saw. Luckily, no one was injured, but the saddest part was that the owners of the farm lost everything that night to the fire, including 2 of their pet dogs. To this day, they have not caught the person responsible. As I grew older, I often thought back to that night and wondered about the figure I had seen and that twisted smile. Who were they? What were they doing there? And most importantly, why did they start the fire? I will never know, but that night will forever be etched into my memory. I've always hated working over the clock, especially during the holiday season. But as a delivery driver for a small courier company, it was my job to make sure deliveries made it on time, plus the overtime was worth it. It was Christmas Eve and I had several stops to make before I could go home and relax. I was approaching my second-to-last address of the night. The house was located down a long, snowed-in gravel road surrounded by dense woods near the edge of town. As I drove down the dark and winding path, I couldn't shake off this eerie feeling in my gut. I had never been to this area before and was relying heavily on my GPS. As I finally pulled up to the address, my uneasiness only grew stronger. There were a few other abandoned-looking houses in the area, but this one was an old Queen Anne-style house at a dead end. A few of the windows were boarded up and the white paint was peeling off all over the exterior. I thought to myself, this can't be the right place, but according to my GPS, this was the correct address. I noticed that all the lights were off. It was strange, as most people would have their Christmas lights on, or at least a porch light. I hesitated for a moment, contemplating whether to just leave the package at the doorstep and move on. But my job required me to make sure the package was received by someone. So I gathered my courage, took a deep breath, and made my way to the front door. I climbed up the snowed-in staircase leading to the front door, hoping that they wouldn't collapse. I reached the worn-down-looking door and firmly knocked. I waited, but there was no response. So I knocked again, a little harder this time. As I waited again, I thought to myself who would live here. It didn't look like anyone had been here in a while based off of the snow buildup. I went to reach for a third knock, but to my surprise, I heard a person shouting from behind me off in the distance. It was faint, but it was definitely a person, like it was coming from back down the snowy gravel road. My sense of unease only doubled, and it was getting dark fast. I decided to just leave in a hurry and mark it for attempted delivery. But as I headed down the stairs, I slipped and fell hard on my ass, dropping the package and sliding the rest of the way. I started to get up and collect myself when the shouting I was hearing became more apparent, and I glanced at something out of the corner of my eye and turned my head in shock. I could make out a person approaching me from down the gravel road about 70 yards or so away. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but he had a long object in his hands and was waving it around maniacally. I knew something was not right. But before I could say anything back, the person began to sprint towards me, flailing the bat around. At that point, I ran back to my van as fast as I could, leaving the package and not stopping for anything. As soon as I reached my van, I locked the doors and started the ignition. I could see the person getting closer in the side mirror, still shouting and swinging the bat. I quickly backed out of the driveway and began to speed down the road, trying not to hit the person. Once I could see him upcoming on the left in my headlights, you could tell that he was deranged, especially with that bat in his hands. His hair was wild and unkempt. His eyes had a crazed look in them and his clothes were practically missing. I couldn't believe what was happening, all over a package delivery. I was afraid he was going to try and jump in front of my van and attempt to block me in, but thankfully as I passed him, he only swung the bat at my headlight, causing it to break. I just kept on driving down the snowy road, cautiously checking my mirrors. I kid you not, in my side mirror, I could see 2 or 3 more people appear from the tree line near where the man was now standing. They seemed to be shouting and waving their arms at me. It was a scene straight out of a horror movie, except this was really happening. My heart was racing as I tried to process what had just happened. Was this just a prank or some sort of misunderstanding? I didn't want to find out. I drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I was far away from that creepy house and those crazy people. I immediately called the police, who took down my information. They then said they would send somebody out, but it might take a while. I never heard back from police about the incident or if they ever found anyone. To this day, I still wonder what would have happened if they had gotten to me, and I have never accepted a delivery in that area again.